By the late winter of 1887, the high country east of the Wind River Range had already swallowed more men than any newspaper bothered to print. The cold up there did not simply kill, it erased. Men walked out of trading posts in the gray hour before dawn and were never spoken of again until the spring melt revealed a boot, a buckle, a piece of canvas frozen into the side of a creek bank. Silas Renfrew, a 41-year-old fur trapper out of the Sweetwater drainage, had lived long enough in that country to know exactly how easily a man could become one of those forgotten names. And on the morning the snow began falling sideways across the upper basin, he understood with absolute clarity that the country was preparing to try the same thing with him. He had been moving south along the frozen drainage for 9 days. Behind him lay the burned-out cabin his brother Eben had built 2 summers earlier on a flat above the river. Eben had died there in November, coughing blood into a tin basin, while the wind hammered the stove pipe loose, and Silas had buried him under a cairn of Black River stones because the ground was already frozen too hard to dig. The cabin had burned 3 nights later, struck by lightning during a freak warm spell, and Silas had walked out of the smoking ruin carrying only what he could fit into a single oilcloth pack: a rifle, a small iron pot, a coil of waxed line, a folding knife, a bundle of dry tinder wrapped in greased leather, and in his coat pocket a tintype of Eben taken in Cheyenne the year before, edges already curling from the heat of the fire. His destination was a Mormon settlement another 40 miles south on the Green River, where an old trapping partner named Hollis Kemp ran a small dry goods store and would not turn him away. 40 miles, 3 days under good weather, maybe 4 if the drifts held. But on the morning of the 9th day, when Silas climbed out of the willow brush along the frozen creek and looked north, he understood the weather was no longer going to hold at all. The sky above the Wind River peaks had turned the color of slate roofing left out through a long rain. There was no wind yet. That was the thing that frightened him most. He had crossed enough mountain country in his life to know that when the high air went perfectly still in February, it was not stillness. It was something gathering itself before it moved. The pine tops above the creek had stopped swaying. The few crows that had followed him for the last 2 days had vanished from the cottonwoods. Even the small sound of the creek running beneath its ice had seemed to soften into something distant and uncertain. Silas stopped on the trail and stood still for a long moment, listening to a silence that was not silence at all. Then he looked at the country around him with new eyes. Not the eyes of a man traveling toward somewhere, but the eyes of a man trying to find a place to disappear before the world above him collapsed. The drainage offered nothing. The willows along the creek were too thin to block any real wind. The pines on the slopes above stood too far apart, branches too high, no thick understory to break a gust. The exposed shoulders of the ridges rose bare against the gathering sky, and any traveler caught on them when the storm reached the valley would simply be swept away like loose ash from a hearthstone. Silas turned slowly in place, breath rising in a slow white plume that did not drift in any direction at all. And then he saw it. Half a mile up the side drainage to the west, where a narrow tributary cut down through black volcanic rock into the main creek, hung a long pale curtain of frozen water. The waterfall had stopped flowing sometime in late November, and the cold of the deep winter had thickened it inward against itself, until it now formed a wall of blue-white ice nearly 40 feet tall, glowing faintly against the dark stone behind it. Silas had passed beneath that waterfall in summer 3 years earlier, hunting a wounded elk that had crossed the drainage above it. He remembered something then that almost no traveler ever remembered about waterfalls in that country. Behind the falling water, carved into the cliff face by centuries of churning current, there had been a hollow. Silas did not move at first. He stood in the willow brush with the gray sky pressing lower across the peaks, and forced himself to think through what he remembered about that hollow with the cold precision of a man counting cartridges before a long hunt. The cavity behind the frozen falls had not been deep, maybe 8 feet from the back wall of the cliff to the inside surface of the ice, maybe 12 feet wide at the base, narrowing upward as the rock curved. The floor had been littered with smooth river stones in summer, polished by the waterfall's spray over countless seasons. And most important of all, he remembered the air inside that hollow had been strangely quiet even with water thundering down across the opening only inches from his shoulder. The ice would do now what the falling water had done then. It would shut the world out. He shifted the oilcloth pack on his back and started walking up the side drainage. The first flakes began falling before he had crossed the first switchback, small dry crystals that did not melt against his coat, but instead bounced off the wool like grains of salt. He had seen that kind of snow before. It was the snow that arrived before the real snow, the messenger flakes that came running ahead of the storm. He quickened his pace without breaking into a trot, because a trapper who broke into a trot in deep cold sweated under his clothes, and a man who sweated under his clothes in the Wind River country in February was already preparing his own grave, whether he understood it yet or not. The climb up the tributary drainage took longer than he remembered. The summer trail had vanished entirely beneath 3 feet of drifted powder, and Silas had to break his own path through the willows along the frozen creek bed, lifting each snowshoe carefully so the rawhide webbing did not catch in the buried brush. His breath rolled out in short, controlled clouds. Above him, the sky kept lowering itself toward the peaks, and somewhere far up the basin he could hear the first thin moan of wind beginning to slide down off the high country toward the valley below. When the frozen waterfall finally came into view through a gap in the lodgepole pines, Silas stopped walking and felt something tighten low in his chest. The wall of ice was larger than he remembered, and from a distance it looked solid, sealed completely to the cliff face on both sides. He had counted on a gap, a break, some opening along the edge where a man could slip through into the hollow behind. If the ice had frozen flush against the stone all the way around, the hollow would be sealed off from him as completely as if buried beneath 100 feet of granite. He climbed the last 40 yards of slope with his heart beating high in his throat and the dry snow falling thicker around him. When he reached the base of the falls, he stood for a moment in the strange, muted light beneath the curtain of ice. The whole world had taken on a faint blue cast, the way a room takes on color from a stained glass window in winter sunlight. The ice loomed above him in long vertical ridges and grooves, frozen mid-pour, every drop of the autumn's last running water locked into the shape it had held at the moment the deep cold arrived. And there, along the right edge of the falls where the stone of the cliff turned sharply back into a small alcove, Silas saw what he had hoped to see. A gap, narrow, not more than 2 feet wide at its base, tapering upward to nothing where the ice had finally welded itself to the rock 6 feet overhead. It was the kind of opening a man could slip through sideways if he turned his shoulders flat against the stone. It was enough. Silas did not let himself feel relief. He had lived too long in country like this to mistake the discovery of a door for the building of a shelter. The hollow behind the ice would not save him on its own. What he did inside it during the next few hours, before the storm reached full strength across the high basin, would determine whether the hollow became his shelter, or simply the small dark room in which a wandering trapper froze quietly to death while the wind howled past outside. He set the oilcloth pack down against the base of the cliff and unbuckled it with stiff fingers. Then he stood still for a long moment and made himself look hard at the gap before going through it. The lesson had been beaten into him years earlier by an old Shoshone trapper named Two Coats who had taught him the first hard winters along the Sweetwater. Never enter a shelter you have not measured with your eyes. A hollow could collapse. A roof could carry loose stone. An animal could be sleeping inside. A man who stepped into the dark without knowing what waited there gave away the only weapon he still owned in the cold country, which was his ability to choose what happened next. Silas drew his folding knife and held it open at his side. Then he leaned his shoulder into the gap and slowly turned his body sideways into the cliff. The ice scraped against the front of his coat as he slipped through. The cold of it bled straight through the wool and bit at his ribs. For a moment he was wedged between the stone of the cliff and the frozen water, unable to move his arms freely, unable to see anything ahead but the dim blue light filtering through the curtain of ice. Then he twisted his hips and pushed forward, and the gap widened around him, and he stepped into the hollow behind the falls. The space opened wider than he had remembered. The cavity ran perhaps 14 feet across at its widest, narrowing toward the back wall where the cliff curved inward into a kind of low alcove. The floor was uneven, scattered with smooth river stones and broken slabs of darker rock that had fallen from the ceiling over centuries. The roof rose maybe 9 feet above his head at the front, sloping down toward the back, until a man would have to crouch to reach the deepest point. The air inside was bitterly cold but completely motionless, and the absence of moving air made the cold feel different than the cold outside. Heavier, older, like the cold of a deep cellar that had never seen sunlight. Silas closed the knife and stood still in the blue half-light. The waterfall behind him glowed faintly from the gray daylight bleeding through it, casting long, pale shadows across the stone floor. He listened. No drip, no shift of loose ice. No rustle of any sleeping creature. The hollow was empty. He turned slowly in place and began to take inventory of the space the way a man surveys a house he has just bought in the dark. The back wall of the alcove rose dry and solid. No seeps of running water, no streaks of fresh ice that would indicate melting and refreezing through the warm hours of the day. That mattered. A shelter that grew wetter as the sun moved across it would freeze a sleeping man to the floor by midnight. The floor itself sat slightly higher at the back than at the front, which meant any meltwater would run forward toward the ice curtain rather than pooling beneath him. That mattered more. And along the right-hand wall, perhaps 4 feet above the floor, ran a long horizontal shelf of stone wide enough to hold his pack and rifle and tinder bundle clear of the cold ground. It was, he understood with the slow certainty of a man who had slept rough in mountain country for 20 years, a better room than most cabins he had ever known. The walls were already built. The roof was already in place. The door was already shut against the storm. What remained was the work of every shelter ever built in cold country, which was not the work of construction but the work of sealing. Of finding the seams where the wind would try to slip through and closing them one by one before the storm arrived in full force. He stepped back to the gap and looked at it from inside the hollow. From this angle, he could see what he had not seen from the trail outside. The opening narrowed at its base into a kind of slot only 8 inches wide, where the ice had grown out from the rock at floor level. The middle of the gap, where his shoulders had passed through, would be the worst of it. That was where the wind would come hunting once the storm crossed the ridge above. That was the wound he would have to close before the bleeding started. Silas stepped back outside the gap into the falling snow and worked fast now, because the dry messenger flakes had thickened into something heavier, and the moan of wind sliding down off the upper basin had grown into a low, continuous voice that no longer rose and fell but simply held. He had perhaps an hour, maybe less. He moved first to the small grove of lodgepole pines that grew along the base of the cliff 50 yards downstream from the falls. The trees were young, slender, most of them no thicker than a man's forearm. He chose 3 that had died standing during the previous dry summer and now leaned against their living neighbors with brittle gray needles still clinging to the upper branches. Dead standing wood, the trapper's friend. It carried no moisture in its core, would not hiss and steam when burned, and could be felled with 3 or 4 hard cuts of a heavy knife. Silas drew his belt hatchet from the pack and worked the first tree free of its anchoring branches with short, controlled strokes. The trunk dropped sideways into the drifts with a soft, heavy sound. He cut the second and third the same way, then dragged all 3 back through the deepening snow toward the base of the frozen falls. He laid them along the cliff in a small, disciplined row. Then he turned back into the storm and went hunting for the second material he needed, which was bough. Not pine bough. Pine bough was tinder and bedding, but it would not seal a wind gap. He needed spruce. Spruce bough was dense, springy, woven full of small needles that locked against each other like the teeth of a comb, and a thick wad of fresh spruce pressed into an opening would stop wind better than half-inch board. He found a stand of young spruce on the slope above the falls and cut bough after bough until the snow at his feet was littered with green branches, and his arms ached from the work. He bundled them with a short length of waxed line and dragged the bundle down to the base of the cliff alongside the lodgepole trunks. Then he went a third time into the storm. The light was already beginning to fade across the basin, and the wind that had been a voice was now a hand, pressing flat against his back as he climbed. He moved up along the base of the cliff 100 yards above the falls until he reached a small frost-shattered scree slope where loose flat stones lay scattered under the snow. He dug with his hatchet and his gloved hands until he had pulled free a dozen good slabs of dark basalt, each one about the size of a tin plate and roughly an inch thick. These he carried back in 2 trips, cradled against his chest beneath his coat, so the cold of the stone would not steal the last warmth from his arms. When he had laid everything out at the base of the cliff, the falling snow already covering the bundle of spruce in a thin white film, Silas paused for one long breath and then turned sideways and began passing the materials through the gap into the hollow behind the ice. The lodgepole trunks went first, fed through the opening one at a time with patient sideways shoves. The bundle of spruce followed, compressed against his chest as he squeezed through. The flat stones came last, passed through in 2 slow, careful loads. By the time he stepped into the hollow for the final time and turned to face the gap, the daylight beyond the ice curtain had dimmed to a pale gray smear, and the wind outside had begun to throw the snow sideways in long horizontal sheets. He took the smallest of the flat basalt stones and stacked them carefully along the floor of the gap, building a low wall perhaps a foot high that filled the narrow slot at the bottom completely. Above that, he wedged a tight braided mat of spruce bough into the central opening, weaving the branches against each other the way a man weaves a willow basket, forcing the needles to lock together under pressure. Above the spruce, he stacked 2 of the lodgepole trunks crosswise into the upper portion of the gap, jamming them tight against the ice on one side and the rock on the other. Then he packed loose snow into every remaining seam with his bare hands, pressing it hard until the snow froze in place against the cold of the stone. When he stepped back from the sealed gap and looked at his work, the hollow had already begun to feel different. The faint blue light that had filtered through the ice curtain still glowed at the front of the space, but the small slot of gray daylight that had marked the opening was now closed completely, replaced by a darker patch of stone and spruce and packed snow that looked, in the dim interior light, like part of the cliff wall itself. The wind that had been hunting at his back the whole time he worked was no longer touching him. It still moved beyond the ice. He could hear it now as a low, continuous rush, like the sound of a distant river running through a deep canyon. But it no longer searched along his collar. It no longer slipped beneath the hem of his coat. The ceiling had held. Silas allowed himself one small breath of something that was not yet relief but was perhaps its first cousin. Then he turned to the rest of the work, because a sealed shelter without heat was only a slower kind of grave. He moved to the stone shelf along the right-hand wall and set his pack on it. He took out the iron pot, the bundle of dry tinder wrapped in greased leather, his folding knife, and a small horn cup that had been Eben's. He placed them in a careful row on the shelf. Then he took the third lodgepole trunk, the one he had not used in the gap, and laid it lengthwise along the back wall of the hollow at the deepest point of the alcove. He cut it into 3 sections with his hatchet, the dry wood splitting cleanly under each stroke. He stacked the sections into a small tight pyramid in the center of the floor, packed dry pine bark into the spaces between them, and built a careful nest of his tinder bundle in the heart of the pyramid. He worked his striker against the steel, and the first sparks dropped into the tinder and caught. The flame rose small and yellow, then climbed into the bark, then into the dry pine, and within a few minutes a small steady fire was burning at the center of the hollow. The smoke rose straight up toward the ceiling and Silas watched it carefully, because this was the moment a man learned whether he had built a shelter or a coffin. If the smoke pooled and thickened and began drifting back down toward the floor, He would have to put out the fire and accept the cold, because a sealed shelter that filled with smoke would kill him quietly in his sleep long before the cold ever did. But the smoke did not pool. It climbed along the curved ceiling of the alcove and slid forward across the inside surface of the ice. And then, near the top of the ice curtain where the frozen water met the overhanging stone of the cliff, it found something Silas had not been able to see from outside. A small dark seam, a natural chimney where the ice had not quite welded itself to the rock. The smoke slipped into the seam and disappeared. Silas watched that small gray stream vanish upward into the stone and felt something move behind his ribs that he had not felt since the morning he had buried Eben under the river cairn. It was not happiness. It was not even hope, exactly. It was the older, harder thing that came before hope, the recognition that the country had not yet decided to take him. He sat down on the cold stone floor with his back against the rear wall of the alcove and let the small fire warm the front of his coat. He pulled off his gloves slowly and held his bare hands toward the flames. The fingers were white at the tips, mottled red along the knuckles, but they moved when he flexed them. He had caught the cold before it caught him. He worked his hands open and closed until the blood came back into them in slow, painful waves, and then he pulled out the strip of dried elk meat he had been carrying in his coat pocket and gnawed off a corner of it while the fire burned in front of him and the storm rushed on beyond the ice. Outside, the wind had risen into something Silas had heard only 3 or 4 times in his life. It no longer sounded like weather. It sounded like a freight train passing endlessly through the upper basin, the kind of low, continuous roar that did not rise and did not fall but simply was, the way the ocean is, the way the deep cold is, the way certain final things in the world simply are without permission or apology. Silas had heard that sound once before, years earlier, on a January night in the South Pass country, and he had heard it from inside a sod-roofed line shack with 3 other men. And in the morning 2 of those men had been dead, frozen to their bunks because the sod roof had blown clean off the cabin sometime in the night, and none of them had woken up in time to understand what was happening to them. He had carried that memory in him ever since the way a man carries a scar. The freight train sound meant the storm had crossed from being weather into being something else, something the old trappers along the Sweetwater had a name for in their own language that did not translate cleanly into English. The closest a man could come was the killing wind, the wind that did not pass through, the wind that stayed. Silas listened to it for a long time without moving. The fire crackled softly in front of him. The smoke slipped upward into its small dark seam and disappeared. The ice curtain at the front of the hollow had begun to glow faintly orange now from the firelight, and the long vertical grooves and ridges in the frozen water cast strange wavering shadows across the stone walls of the alcove. It was, he realized, the first time since November that he had been warm, truly warm. Not the brittle false warmth of walking hard against the cold, but the slow real warmth of a fire burning steadily in a sealed space. He could feel it working its way into the wool of his coat, into the leather of his boots, into the deep aching places in his shoulders where the pack straps had cut for 9 days. He took the iron pot off the shelf and packed it tight with clean snow scraped from the inside base of the ice curtain. He set the pot at the edge of the fire and waited. The snow melted slowly into water, and when the water came to a low simmer, he dropped in 2 strips of dried elk and a small pinch of salt from a twist of paper he kept in his pack. The smell that rose from the pot was the smell of every winter camp he had ever made in his life, and for a moment he had to set down the horn cup he was holding because his hands had begun to shake in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He had not let himself think about Eben since climbing up the side drainage that morning. There had been no room for thinking about Eben. There had been only room for thinking about ice and wind and the gap behind the falls and the work of staying alive through the next few hours. But now the work was done, and the fire was burning, and the small pot was simmering at the edge of the flames, and the storm outside had become the killing wind, and there was suddenly nowhere left for the thought of Eben to hide. It came up out of the dark stone floor of the hollow, the way water comes up out of a buried spring, slow and steady and impossible to stop. He saw his brother again as he had seen him in the last week before the cough took him. Sitting on the edge of the rope-strung bunk in the cabin above the river, blanket pulled up around his shoulders, head bent forward as if he were studying something on the floor between his boots that no one else could see. Eben had been the younger of the two of them by 4 years. He had come west in 1881 because Silas had come west in 1877, and he had taken up trapping because Silas had taken up trapping, and he had built the cabin above the river because Silas had told him in a letter from Cheyenne that the country up there was good country, and a man could make a life in it if he was willing to work hard enough. Silas pulled the pot off the fire and poured the broth into the horn cup. The cup warmed his hands through the thin walls of the horn, and he held it for a long time without drinking. The steam rose into his face, and his eyes burned in a way he did not want to name. He had not cried at the burial. He had not cried at the cairn. He had not cried when the cabin burned 3 nights later, or when he walked away from the smoking ruin with the tintype in his pocket and the oilcloth pack on his back. But sitting in the hollow behind the frozen falls with the killing wind passing outside and his brother's horn cup warm in his hands, he understood that what he had carried out of that burned cabin had not been grief at all. It had been the absence of grief. The hollow place where grief should have been but had not yet arrived because there had been no shelter quiet enough for it to find him. The shelter was quiet enough now. He let it come. He did not fight it. He sat with his back against the cold stone of the alcove, and the horn cup warm in his hands, and he let the long ache that had been waiting for him since November rise slowly through his chest, and into his throat and behind his eyes. The fire burned on in front of him. The smoke slipped up into its small dark seam. The ice curtain glowed faintly orange in the firelight, and beyond it the killing wind ran on across the upper basin and did not touch him. After a while Silas drank the broth, and after a while longer he set the empty cup on the stone shelf beside Eben's tintype, which he had taken out of his coat pocket without quite remembering the motion of doing it. The image had survived the fire and the 9 days of walking. The edges were curled and the surface was clouded, but the face was still the face. Eben at 23, standing stiff in front of a painted backdrop in a Cheyenne studio, eyes fixed on the camera with the slight wary expression of a man who had not yet decided whether the photographer could be trusted. Silas set the tintype on the shelf where the firelight could reach it. Then he leaned his head back against the stone and closed his eyes for the first time in 9 days. He slept. He did not mean to sleep. He had told himself he would only rest his eyes for a moment, that he would keep watch on the fire and the seal of the gap and the small chimney where the smoke escaped. But the warmth and the broth and the long final letting go of what he had been carrying since November worked on him together, and somewhere between one breath and the next, he passed into a sleep deeper than any he had known in months. He did not dream of Eben. He did not dream of the burning cabin. He did not dream of the killing wind passing beyond the ice. He dreamed of nothing at all, which was perhaps the kindest gift the country had given him in a long time. When he woke, the fire had burned down to a bed of red coals, and the ice curtain at the front of the hollow no longer glowed orange but only the faintest pale gray. He had no way to know how many hours had passed. The roar of the killing wind had not stopped, but it had changed. It no longer sounded like a freight train. It sounded like the slow, heavy breathing of something enormous and tired that had been working hard all night and was beginning, perhaps, to slow down. Silas sat up slowly. His shoulders ached. His hands were stiff, but he was warm under his coat, and his breath rose in only a thin, pale plume rather than the heavy white clouds it had been making when he first entered the hollow. The fire had done its work. The sealed gap had done its work. The hollow itself, that ancient room carved into the cliff by water no man had ever seen running, had done its work. He was alive, and the country had not yet decided to take him, and somewhere outside in the gray world beyond the ice the killing wind was beginning to lose its grip on the upper basin. He fed 3 more sticks of lodgepole onto the coals and watched the new flames climb. He did not try to leave the hollow that day. A man who survived the first night of a killing wind, only to walk out into the second night because he had grown impatient, was a man who had not understood what he had survived. Silas had seen that mistake made before, by younger trappers who counted the slackening of a storm as its ending, and stepped out of their shelters into what they thought was the calm, only to find that the calm was a pause, and the second wave of the storm was already gathering somewhere up the basin. He fed the fire carefully through the long gray hours and rationed the broth and slept again in shorter measured pieces, waking every few hours to check the seal at the gap and the small chimney where the smoke escaped. The killing wind passed sometime in the deep of the second night. Silas knew the moment it ended because he woke to a silence so complete that for a long disoriented breath he thought he had gone deaf. There was no roar beyond the ice. No low, continuous voice in the upper basin. No distant rush like a river running through a canyon. There was only the faint, soft crackle of his small fire and the sound of his own breathing in the dark stone room behind the falls. He lay very still and listened. After a long while he heard, very faintly, the small dry tick of snow crystals settling against the outside of the ice curtain. That was all. The country had finished what it had come to do and had moved on south toward the lower basins, and the upper drainage of the Wind River was now wrapped in the strange, exhausted stillness that always followed a killing wind, the silence of a world that had spent everything it had and was lying empty in the aftermath. Silas allowed himself to sleep again. When he woke for the final time, the ice curtain at the front of the hollow was glowing with the pale, clean light of a winter morning, and he understood that the storm was truly over. He did not break the seal at the gap right away. He sat for a long time on the stone floor with the firelight fading into the daylight and worked through in his mind what he would find on the other side. The drifts would be deep, possibly very deep. The trail he had broken up the side drainage would be gone completely. The lodgepole grove where he had cut the dead trees would be buried to the lower branches. The Green River settlement still lay 40 miles south of him, and now those 40 miles would be 40 miles of broken country under fresh deep snow, with every familiar landmark erased and every creek crossing transformed into a hidden hazard beneath a smooth white surface. The work of getting out, he understood, was going to be harder in some ways than the work of getting in. Survival did not end at the breaking of the seal. It only changed shape. He drank the last of the broth. He pulled on his gloves and laced his boots tight and shouldered the oilcloth pack. He tucked Eben's tintype back into the inside pocket of his coat. Then he turned to the gap and began carefully dismantling the seal he had built 2 days earlier. The lodgepole trunks came down first, the dry wood frozen now against the ice and the rock but still loose enough to work free with patient sideways pressure. The braided mat of spruce bough came next, the green needles crusted with hoarfrost from the slow seeping of warm air against the cold ice. The flat basalt stones came last, lifted one by one off the floor of the gap and set aside on the shelf. When the seal was fully open, Silas felt the new air come in across his face for the first time in 2 days, and it was so clean and so cold and so utterly without movement that it felt less like wind and more like water, the still water of a deep mountain pool that a man steps into without warning. He turned sideways and slipped through the gap. The world beyond the ice curtain had been remade. The slope below the falls, which had been broken country of brush and stone 2 days earlier, was now a long, smooth white sheet that curved unbroken down to the main drainage half a mile below. The lodgepole grove where he had cut his dead trees was buried to the upper branches, only the topmost crowns of the tallest trees showing above the drifts like small dark islands in a frozen sea. The black volcanic cliff that rose above the falls had been transformed into something pale and softened, every ledge and crack filled with packed snow, the whole face of the country glowing faintly under a sky that had cleared to a thin washed-out blue, so cold it seemed almost colorless. The sun was up, but it carried no warmth. It sat low above the southern ridge and threw long blue shadows across the new snow. Silas stood beneath the frozen falls and breathed the still air and turned slowly in place to look at the world the storm had left behind. There was no sound anywhere. Not a bird. Not a tree branch shifting under its load. Not the small, dry whisper of any wind at all. The country had emptied itself completely, and what remained was a kind of quiet that a man heard only a few times in a life and never forgot afterward, the quiet of survival measured against an absence. He turned back and looked at the ice curtain one last time. From outside, with the morning sun catching the long vertical grooves and ridges, the falls had become a pale blue wall again, sealed and seamless, with no sign at all that a man had spent 2 nights behind it, or that a small fire had burned at the heart of the cliff, while the killing wind passed overhead. The hollow had taken him in and let him go again, and had kept its own counsel about the matter, the way old country always did. Silas raised one gloved hand toward the ice in a small private gesture that he did not entirely understand. Then he turned south and began the long, broken walk down toward the main drainage. It took him 4 days to reach the Mormon settlement on the Green River. 4 days of breaking trail through drifts that came to his waist in the open country, and to his chest in the willows along the creeks. 4 days of moving slowly across a landscape that had been so completely transformed by the killing wind that he twice had to climb to high ground and study the line of distant ridges before he could be sure he was still walking south. He passed 2 things on the way that he did not stop to examine closely. The first was a small dark shape half buried in a drift near the mouth of a side drainage, which from a distance had the shape of a saddled horse lying on its side. The second was a place along the main creek where the snow had been disturbed in a long, narrow trough, as if something heavy had been dragged through it before the final wind had come down and smoothed the trough partly over. He did not stop. He kept walking. There would be time later, he knew, for the country to give up what it had taken, and it was not the work of a single survivor to count those losses. When he came down off the last ridge above the Green River on the 4th afternoon, and saw the cluster of low log buildings smoking gently against the white valley floor, he stopped walking and stood for a long moment with his hands at his sides, and let the relief move through him in slow waves. He had not allowed himself to feel it before. A man did not feel relief while the work was still being done. But the work was done now, and the smoke from the chimneys of the settlement was rising straight up into the cold, still air, and somewhere in one of those buildings, Hollis Kemp was almost certainly stocking shelves and complaining to whoever would listen about the price of coffee in Wyoming territory. Silas walked down off the ridge. The first person to see him coming was a Mormon woman drawing water from the settlement well, who looked up as he came across the flat, and then stood very still with the bucket forgotten in her hand. She had heard, as everyone in the valley had heard, the news that had come down out of the upper country in the days after the storm. The Sweetwater trapper, the man who had been seen heading south along the frozen drainage the morning the sky went still. Search parties had ridden out from 3 settlements. None of them had come back with a body, but none of them had come back with a man either. And after the second day, the talk in the valley had turned quietly to the question of where, exactly, along the 40 miles of broken country between the burned cabin and the Green River, Silas Renfrew was lying frozen beneath the new snow. The woman at the well had heard the talk. She had been one of the women who carried bread to the searchers when they came back empty-handed on the 3rd evening. She set the bucket down slowly and put one hand flat against her apron, and did not move while Silas walked the last 100 yards across the flat toward the settlement. Hollis Kemp came out of the dry goods store before Silas reached the porch, alerted by something in the way the woman at the well was standing. He was a short, broad man with a gray beard cut square at the bottom and small, careful eyes that had seen a great many things in the country over 20 years, and were not easily surprised by any of them. But when he saw Silas crossing the last of the open ground toward him, Hollis Kemp stopped on the top step of the porch and put one hand against the doorframe to steady himself, and his small, careful eyes filled with something that was not surprise but was very close to it. "They said you was dead," Hollis said, when Silas reached the bottom of the steps. His voice was rough. "3 parties out. Nobody come back with sign of you. Folks been arguing 2 days where you went down." Silas stopped at the foot of the steps and looked up at him. His beard was crusted with frost to the collar. His coat was stiff. His eyes were red-rimmed from 4 days of sun glare off new snow. But he was standing on his own feet and his hands were steady at his sides. "Went behind the falls," he said. Holly's Kemp stared down at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when something he has half known all his life has finally been said out loud by someone else. He stepped down off the porch and put one hand on Silas's shoulder and turned him toward the door of the store, and the woman at the well picked up her bucket and went on drawing water, and the smoke from the chimneys of the settlement rose straight up into the cold, still air, and the country went on being the country. The story of the trapper who survived behind the frozen waterfall spread through the valley settlements that winter and on into the spring. It traveled the way frontier stories always traveled, by mouth and by memory, without ink or paper to fix it in any one shape. Different versions grew up in different places. In one telling, Silas had spent 4 nights behind the falls, in another only one. In one telling, he had killed a sleeping bear in the hollow with his folding knife before he could shelter there, which was not true. In one telling, the truest of them, an old Shoshone man at a trading post on the Sweetwater listened to the story all the way through, and then said quietly that his grandfather had sheltered behind that same waterfall during a killing wind in 1843, and that the hollow had been known to his people for longer than anyone could remember, and that the country gave such places to certain men in certain hours for reasons that did not need to be explained. Silas himself rarely told the story. When pressed, he would say only that he had found a hollow behind some ice and built a small fire and waited for the storm to pass, and that there was nothing more to it than that. But on certain winter evenings, sitting alone by the stove in the back room of Holly's Kemp's store with the lamp turned low, he would sometimes take Eben's tintype out of his coat pocket and set it on the table in front of him and look at it for a long time without speaking. And he would think of the small dark seam at the top of the ice curtain where the smoke had found its way out, and the still pocket of air behind the wall the country had built before he ever arrived, and the long quiet inside the hollow while the killing wind passed by overhead and did not find him. Because in the end, the lesson of the Wind River country was the same lesson that had been carried down through every cold season since men first walked in such places. The storm did not need to be defeated. It only needed to be allowed to pass. And the man who lived was not the man who fought the wind. He was the man who found the still place the wind could not reach, and who had the patience to wait there in the dark until the country was finished with its work, and then to step back out into the morning and walk on.